The first time I saw him, the air itself seemed to change. Conversations faltered mid-sentence. The clinking of glasses became hesitant, and the dim golden light in the restaurant suddenly felt colder. He walked in with that slow, deliberate confidence of a man who knew no one in the room would ever dare to interrupt his path. The dark wool suit he wore wasn't just expensive. It was the kind of fabric that whispered power, tailored so precisely it seemed to command the space around him. Even the maitre d', who had seen everyone from senators to movie stars, straightened his back and lowered his voice as if the man's shadow demanded it. They said his name like it was a warning. Mr. Carrington. The kind of millionaire whose money didn't just buy things, it bent people. He didn't raise his voice, didn't need to. His influence stretched far beyond the marble floor of that dining room. Rumor had it he owned half the block, and the other half owed him something. I had heard stories. The chef who refused to work for him and suddenly lost every contract in the city. The couple who fought him in court and ended up selling their home for a fraction of its worth. People didn't just fear his wealth. They feared the quiet, invisible reach of it. That night, the air smelled faintly of roasted duck and aged wine. But there was another scent too. Something tense, electric, like the moment before a storm. I was wiping down the counter when I noticed her. She was new. I hadn't seen her on the floor before. Her uniform fit differently. Not stiff and hurried like most of us wore it, but precise, like she'd made sure every crease was in place. Her skin was the color of warm earth. Her hair pulled back into a simple bun that did nothing to hide the quiet fire in her eyes. There was a calm in the way she moved, a deliberate grace that didn't match the anxious energy of the staff. She saw him the moment he entered, but unlike the others, she didn't lower her gaze. It wasn't defiance exactly, it was more like recognition, as if she'd seen men like him before, and whatever intimidation he carried wasn't enough to touch her. Mr. Carrington took his usual table in the corner, the one facing the entire room, his back to the wall like a general surveying a battlefield. People made a point to avoid walking too close to him, except for the waitress assigned to his table. Tonight, that would be her. I watched as she approached, her steps steady, not hurried, her tray balanced effortlessly in one hand. She greeted him with the same tone she'd used for the couple at table 7, neither sweeter nor sharper. I couldn't hear their words over the low hum of the dining room, but I could see the subtle shift in his expression. The faint narrowing of his eyes, the way his mouth curved, not into a smile, but into something that hinted at amusement or warning. It wasn't long before I noticed other eyes turning toward them. Not in open curiosity, but in that quiet, sideways way people glance when they sense something unusual. Whatever passed between them in those first minutes was invisible to most, but not to me. I could see it in the set of her shoulders, in the way his gaze lingered a second too long. Later, I'd realized that this was the beginning. Not of a clash, but of something far more dangerous. Because in a place where everyone feared him, she was the first person who didn't seem to. And that, I would come to learn, was the kind of thing a man like Carrington could never ignore. It was strange, the way time seemed to bend when Mr. Carrington was in the room. Minutes felt longer, conversations quieter. He didn't speak loudly, but somehow his words seemed to carry farther than anyone else's. I'd been working at that restaurant long enough to see what fear looked like when it wrapped itself around people's throats. It was in the way their laughter became forced, the way they nodded too quickly, agreed too easily. And that night, all those little signs were there, except for her. Her name, I would later learn, was Amara. That evening, she didn't look like someone who had just started a new job. No nervous fidgeting, no uncertain glances to the manager for approval. She handled the silver tray like it was an extension of her arm, moving between tables with a rhythm that suggested she'd been here for years, though I knew she hadn't. She reached his table with a small notepad in hand, though I had the feeling she didn't really need it. Mr. Carrington spoke first, he always did. His lips barely moved, his voice a low rumble that you could almost feel more than hear. She wrote something down, nodded once, and then this caught my attention. She asked him a question. Not a timid clarification. Not the cautious tone of someone afraid to bother a man like him. No, she asked it like a peer might, like someone who expected a real answer. His gaze lifted from the wine list, slow as a shadow stretching across the floor, and for a moment I thought she had made a mistake. But then something flickered across his face. Not annoyance, but curiosity. Mr. Carrington was a man who thrived on the predictability of others. People bent to his rhythm, not the other way around. And here was this new waitress, speaking to him in a way no one else dared to. I was close enough to catch bits of their conversation when she returned to the table with his drink. He made a comment, something about how the wine should be handled, and she responded without hesitation, her tone respectful but firm, as though she were correcting him without making it look like a correction. It was subtle, but it was there. A couple at the table nearest to them glanced over, their eyes widening slightly. One of the bussers, a kid named Theo, passed by and gave me a look as if to say, "Is she crazy?" We'd all heard the unspoken rule. Don't challenge Mr. Carrington. Not about business, not about politics, and certainly not about his taste in wine. The evening stretched on, the tension between them becoming a kind of silent thread. He watched her closely, not with the dismissive glance he gave most people, but with a kind of measured interest. Every time she approached, his posture shifted slightly, leaning forward just a fraction, as if he were trying to catch something she might let slip. What struck me most was that she didn't seem to be playing a game. This wasn't calculated rebellion. It was simply the way she was. She treated him like she treated everyone else. Like a man, not a force of nature. And in a room where people tiptoed around his ego, that alone was enough to draw the sharp edge of his attention. Later, in the quiet after closing, I would think about the look in his eyes that night. It wasn't just curiosity. It was the same look I'd seen in predators when something unexpected moves in their territory. Not fear, not yet, but the awareness that something is different. Something they don't control. And for a man like Carrington, that difference was a spark he could either snuff out or let burn until it consumed everything. The second time she approached his table, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. You wouldn't notice it if you weren't paying attention, but I'd been in this place long enough to know when the center of gravity moved. It was like the rest of the dining room had started to orbit around that corner table without realizing it. The clink of cutlery seemed softer there. The waiters moved with more care, as if invisible tripwires had been laid across the floor. Amara walked with that same calm stride, her eyes steady, her hands precise. Mr. Carrington leaned back in his chair, swirling the deep red wine in his glass, watching her the way one might watch a chess opponent in the early stages of a game. Curious, calculating, but not yet showing his full strategy. She set down a plate in front of him with a movement so controlled it was almost ceremonial. He said something too low for me to hear clearly, but it made her pause. Not in the way most people froze under his scrutiny, but just long enough to make sure she'd heard him right. Her reply was quiet, but her tone carried across the short distance to where I stood at the counter. It wasn't sharp, but there was weight in it, like a stone dropped into still water. Carrington tilted his head slightly, that faint curve at the corner of his mouth deepening into what might have been a smile. Or maybe it was the beginning of something else. Either way, it didn't reach his eyes. His gaze followed her as she moved away, and I noticed how his fingers tapped once against the stem of his wineglass. An unconscious rhythm, almost impatient. Around the room, subtle reactions were happening. The older couple by the window seemed to be pretending not to listen, but their forks had stopped moving. The young man at the bar leaned in slightly, as if trying to catch the current of tension that had begun to run between them. Theo, the busser, avoided going near Carrington's table entirely, slipping behind the kitchen doors whenever Amara headed that way. I didn't know her well then, none of us did, but I began to sense that her calm wasn't the absence of fear. It was something built over time, forged in places and moments where fear was useless. You could tell in the way she didn't rush, in the way she let silence sit without scrambling to fill it. That kind of composure didn't come from training in fine dining. It came from living through things that had already tested you. When she returned to clear one of his plates, he spoke again, and this time I caught enough to understand. He was asking her questions. Not the idle kind guests ask to make conversation, but probing ones, laced with subtle tests. Where had she worked before? Did she know the vineyard this wine came from? Was she familiar with certain private clubs in the city? Each question was a thread, and I could see him tugging at them, trying to see if she would fray. She didn't. Every answer was calm, direct, and, though polite, never deferential. When she didn't know something, she simply said so, without apology or excuse. That was rare in itself. Most people, when faced with Carrington's attention, stumbled over themselves trying to please him, trying to prove they were worth his regard. She didn't seem interested in proving anything. It was a small thing, maybe even invisible to anyone not looking for it, but I saw it. The moment his gaze sharpened, the shift from curiosity to something closer to challenge. It was as if he'd decided that whatever game they were playing, he was going to raise the stakes. By the end of the night, I had the uneasy sense that something had been set in motion. Amara went about her closing duties like nothing was different, humming under her breath as she wiped down a row of tables. Carrington left without incident, sliding his chair back slowly, offering the faintest nod in her direction as he passed. But his eyes lingered on her for one last second before he walked out, and in that moment, I knew this wasn't over. The next time Mr. Carrington came in, it was a Thursday evening. Thursdays were usually quiet, too late in the week for the midweek crowd, too early for the weekend rush. But when he walked through those double doors, the entire rhythm of the place shifted. Even the kitchen seemed to hush. Chef Marco muttered under his breath, swore in Italian, and told Theo to make sure Carrington's table was perfectly set. Amara was already on the floor, taking an order from a group near the bar. She didn't look up when he entered. That in itself was unusual. Most people glanced instinctively toward the door when someone like him arrived. But she finished scribbling the last note on her pad, thanked the customers, and walked toward the kitchen as if nothing had changed. When she returned a few minutes later, the maitre d' intercepted her. I couldn't hear the full exchange, but I caught enough to know Carrington had specifically asked for her to serve him again. It wasn't framed as a request, more like a certainty. His table was set in the corner, same as always. Amara approached without hurry, without the rehearsed smile most servers wore when dealing with him. He watched her closely, leaning forward slightly, elbows on the table as she greeted him. There was a pause after her first sentence, long enough to make anyone else uncomfortable. But she just stood there, her weight evenly balanced, pen poised over her notepad. This time, his questions came sooner. He asked about the specials, then interrupted to inquire about the seasoning on the lamb. When she answered, he countered with a comment about a restaurant in Paris that prepared it differently, watching her face for any flicker of uncertainty. She didn't flinch. She simply acknowledged his point and added that she preferred the way their chef prepared it, citing the freshness of the local herbs. It was subtle, but I could see it. He was pressing. Each exchange was another gentle push, as though he was leaning against a door to see if it would give. She didn't push back, but she didn't step aside either. Instead, she let his weight rest there, absorbing it without letting it knock her off balance. A couple of tables nearby began to take notice. The young lawyer who came in every Thursday leaned toward his companion, murmuring something while nodding in their direction. The elderly woman by the window kept glancing over the rim of her glass, her eyes sharp and curious. There was something magnetic about the way they interacted, not hostile, but charged, like two fencers circling each other before the first strike. Carrington ordered the lamb after all, and a bottle of wine that cost more than most people's rent. When she brought it to the table, he made a point of inspecting the label, turning the bottle in his hand as if weighing its worth. Then, without looking at her, he asked if she'd ever been to the vineyard it came from. "No," she said simply, her voice even, "but I've read about it. The soil there is volcanic. It gives the grapes a distinctive mineral finish." That was the first time I saw it. A real smile, small and quick, flickering across his face before disappearing again. It wasn't amusement. It was recognition. He wasn't dealing with someone intimidated by his questions. He was dealing with someone who knew exactly how to stand her ground without making it a battle. The rest of the night passed without incident, but the air around his table stayed taut. Every time she approached, the nearby tables seemed to quiet just enough to catch their words. And though nothing explosive happened, I had the distinct feeling that Carrington wasn't finished. He was a man who didn't like unanswered questions, and Amara had become one. When he left, he paused at the door, glancing back toward her station. She was laughing at something Theo had said, her posture relaxed, her back half turned to him. He watched her for a moment longer than necessary before stepping out into the night. It wasn't until later, when I was locking up, that I realized something. For all his power, for all his wealth, that night he had left without the last word. Carrington was the kind of man who returned to correct what he saw as unfinished business. A week after a prior encounter, he came back, this time flanked by two sharply dressed men, one older and imposing, the other younger with a calculating smile. Without a word, Carrington claimed his usual corner table, his eyes briefly passing over Amara. When she approached with menus, the lively hum of the restaurant seemed to shift. Carrington introduced her to his companions as the best waitress in the city, his tone turning the compliment into a subtle challenge. Testing her, he asked what she'd recommend for a man who had dined in the world's finest restaurants. Without hesitation, she suggested braised short ribs, neither flattered nor intimidated. He ordered them. Next came the wine test. He asked her to choose a trap in their world. She selected a mid-tier vintage known for subtlety. His reaction, a faint surprise, showed she had played an unexpected move. Their exchanges throughout the evening became a duel of poise and subtext, like fencers circling without striking. The companions watched closely, and the entire room seemed to sense the gravity of the encounter. When Carrington left, there was a sharper glint in his eyes. Amara had become an opponent worth his attention. The following night, tension filled the air before he even entered. Conversations died mid-sentence. Amara, unshaken, moved toward him with deliberate calm. In front of everyone, he asked how she would handle an order outside her experience. She answered with measured confidence, balancing humility and authority. Carrington probed with veiled criticism, but she stood firm, never defensive. Throughout the meal, he launched small challenges. Questions, remarks, subtle digs, each met with composure. The quiet battle drew the room's attention. When dessert arrived, he made one final attempt to reassert dominance. Amara's calm, precise reply silenced him in front of everyone. Gasps rippled nearby. His companions leaned in. He left without recovering the upper hand. That night, the staff whispered in awe, Amara had shifted something fundamental, proving that fear could be met with grace. The next week, Carrington returned earlier, alone. The atmosphere thickened. The room seemed to brace itself. Amara worked with calm precision but was clearly aware of his scrutiny. He seated himself with deliberate authority, then told her they would see if she understood the difference between service and performance. The meaning was clear. Another test. She accepted without flinching, promising to show the distinction. This was no public spectacle with companions, just the two of them under the gaze of the entire room. As she poured wine, he studied her every movement. His questions probed her expertise, but she answered with quiet authority, weaving details of terroir, climate, and flavor into a confident, effortless presentation. For the first time, his eyes flickered in recognition of her skill. The tests escalated, comments on etiquette, sourcing, judgment, all meant to unsettle her. She deflected each one with composed precision, never overreaching, never shrinking. The subtle duel drew in the other diners. Conversations hushed, silverware stilled. The entire restaurant seemed to lean toward that corner, sensing they were witnessing something rare. A contest not of volume or force, but of intellect, presence, and unshakable poise. By the end of the night, it was clear. Carrington was no longer simply toying with a waitress. He had met an equal. And Amara, without raising her voice, had once again proven that the quietest strength can command the greatest respect. Carrington, despite his reputation and the power he wielded effortlessly in every other context, found himself increasingly unbalanced. His challenges, so effective against anyone else, seemed to hit empty air against her composure. And the more he tried to press, the clearer it became that Amara wasn't reacting out of fear or defiance. She was operating on a level he hadn't anticipated. When dessert arrived, Carrington leaned back in his chair, swirling the wine absent-mindedly, his eyes never leaving her. "You are," he began, hesitated, then let the words hang. He searched for a phrase, a label, any way to categorize the anomaly that she represented, but none came. For the first time in the history of his encounters, a silence fell across the table that wasn't filled by tension alone, but by mutual acknowledgement. Two wills, equally strong, meeting not in open conflict, but in quiet confrontation. Amara's subtle smile didn't waver. She had passed the first true public test with a calm brilliance that left everyone, including Carrington, unsettled. And as he finally rose to leave, there was no applause, no declaration of victory. Only the quiet, unmistakable sense that a shift had occurred, one that would ripple far beyond that corner table, and that would inevitably draw the eyes of those who wielded power in the city. By the time Friday evening arrived, word had quietly spread through the staff. Carrington was returning. Even the regular patrons seemed to notice, their whispers floating through the restaurant with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. But for Amara, there was no visible sign of anxiety. She moved with the same deliberate grace, balancing trays and taking orders as though the storm brewing in the corner of the room didn't exist. Carrington entered alone, his presence immediately folding the space around him into silence. Chairs scraped softly against the floor as he passed, and even the hum of conversation dimmed. He scanned the room with his usual exacting gaze before settling into his corner table. For anyone else, it would have been a moment to shrink back, to bend to the weight of his influence. But Amara met his gaze with steady eyes, her calm a subtle but unmistakable declaration. She would not be intimidated. He didn't speak at first, letting the tension hang, thick as the scent of roasted meats and polished wood. When he finally addressed her, his tone was casual, almost teasing, but it carried the unmistakable undertone of a challenge. "Amara," he said, leaning slightly forward, "tonight I'd like to see if you can manage more than service. Can you handle observation, discretion, and judgment all at once? Can you anticipate not only my desires but those of everyone watching?" Her response was measured, composed, and unwavering. "I can," she said simply. No hesitation, no overconfidence, just certainty. Carrington's eyes narrowed, intrigued. He decided to escalate. "Good. Let's begin then." From that moment on, the evening became a subtle battle of perception and composure. Carrington issued small but deliberate provocations, questions designed to catch her off guard, comments that hinted at criticism or skepticism. Most would have faltered, second-guessed themselves, or offered weak explanations. Amara, however, met each one with a quiet assurance that diffused the subtle pressure he applied. She responded not only with knowledge and skill but with an unspoken authority that neither cowered nor challenged. It simply existed. Around the room, patrons began to notice. Conversations quieted further. A few diners leaned forward, curious, sensing the invisible tension crackling across the corner table. Even the staff became hyper-aware, moving with care, conscious that the ordinary rhythm of the restaurant had been suspended by the subtle war unfolding before them. Carrington's interest deepened as the night progressed. He was used to control, used to authority, accustomed to bending people to his will with subtlety and power. But here, in front of everyone, he was encountering an anomaly. The more he tested, the more evident it became that Amara operated on her own terms, unaffected by the intimidation he wielded so effortlessly elsewhere. At one point, he posed a question designed to provoke public embarrassment, a hypothetical scenario meant to challenge her judgment in front of other diners. She answered with composure, reasoning through the situation clearly and decisively, never defensive, never flustered. Her response carried weight, demonstrating intelligence and insight, and it drew quiet admiration from the room. Carrington's companions, when present in previous encounters, had witnessed these interactions before, but tonight they were absent. This was an unmediated duel. Every glance, every word, Every gesture was amplified by the awareness of the diners and staff. The invisible eyes of the room heightened the stakes, turning an ordinary dinner into a theater of psychological challenge and human dignity. As dessert was served, Carrington leaned back, swirling his wine absent-mindedly, his gaze never leaving her. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then paused, caught off guard by the composed brilliance she radiated. For a man who rarely encountered resistance, who thrived on bending situations to his will, this was unfamiliar terrain. And in that brief silence, I felt it, the first tremor of change, the quiet realization that Amara had begun to shift the balance of power in a room where everyone had previously feared him. When they finally left, Carrington's walk toward the door carried the usual elegance, the usual control. But even as he exited, there was an unspoken acknowledgement in his posture and gaze. He had not won tonight. He had tested, prodded, and challenged, yet she had remained unbroken. And for a man who measured his success by domination, that simple, silent fact was a disruption of the natural order he was used to imposing. By Saturday evening, Carrington's presence had become the topic of hushed whispers among the staff even before the restaurant opened. The news that he would be dining again, alone, unaccompanied, spread quickly, carrying with it a mix of anticipation and apprehension. For most, his arrival meant a night of careful navigation, bending quietly to his will. For Amara, it meant another test, but one she was determined to meet with the same calm authority that had already unsettled him twice before. When he entered, the atmosphere shifted instantly. Conversations softened, glasses paused mid-air, and even the chef, normally impervious to his influence, felt the weight of the room's tension. Carrington's stride was measured, confident, and deliberate. Every eye in the restaurant subtly acknowledged his arrival, yet Amara remained composed, moving gracefully between tables as if the room's collective attention were invisible to her. He chose his corner table as always, placing himself deliberately in the space that allowed observation of both staff and patrons. When Amara approached with the wine list, he didn't introduce her this time. Instead, he spoke as if speaking directly to her alone, his voice carrying an undercurrent of challenge that made even the staff glance instinctively toward the table. "Amara," he began, leaning slightly forward. "Tonight we will see whether composure can withstand scrutiny when every eye is upon you. Can you manage expectations, subtle provocations, and the judgment of an audience, all at once?" Her response was steady, unshaken, and deliberate. "Yes, I can manage all of that." There was no hesitation, no unnecessary flourish, just clarity and calm, the same aura of quiet authority that had first unsettled him weeks ago. Carrington began his subtle tests almost immediately. Each question, each comment, was designed to probe her knowledge, challenge her judgment, or expose a crack in her composure. He spoke of rare wines, of culinary nuances, of past experiences he assumed would intimidate her. Yet with every subtle provocation, she met his gaze and responded with a blend of expertise and dignity that left him momentarily unbalanced. What made this encounter different from the previous ones was the presence of the audience. Patrons began to notice the invisible tension drawing them in. Conversations dimmed to whispers, diners leaned forward in curiosity, and even the staff unconsciously moved in rhythm with her steps, aware of the silent duel unfolding before them. Carrington tried to regain control by escalating the subtleties. He commented on her past experience, subtly questioning whether she had the sophistication to handle fine dining under pressure. He made hypothetical scenarios that he assumed would expose uncertainty. And yet, she responded with clarity, precision, and an unshakable calm. Her words were carefully chosen, demonstrating knowledge and insight without arrogance, defusing his attempts at psychological dominance. The longer the evening progressed, the more noticeable the shift became. Patrons near the corner table exchanged glances, sensing the weight of the interaction. Even those not directly observing Amara could feel the change. The usual aura of fear Carrington carried had dimmed, replaced by a quiet tension in which respect and admiration mingled with disbelief. Dessert was served, and Carrington leaned back, swirling his wine thoughtfully, his gaze fixed on her. For a man accustomed to control, accustomed to bending situations to his will, this was a novel experience. Amara's calm, confident responses had begun to subtly invert the power dynamics in the room. As the dinner concluded, Carrington rose with his usual elegance and composed posture, but there was a new tension in his walk. He had been tested publicly, under the eyes of witnesses, and while he had maintained decorum, he could not ignore the undeniable fact. Amara had weathered every subtle provocation without faltering, and in a room that had once whispered only fear at his presence, she had emerged as a quiet yet undeniable force. That night, as the doors closed and the last guests departed, a murmur ran through the staff, awed recognition of what had occurred. Amara, without raising her voice or challenging authority outright, had begun to shift the perception of power in that space. And Carrington, for all his influence and mastery of intimidation, had encountered something he could neither control nor predict. By Sunday evening, the restaurant was nearly full, a subtle tension settling over the room even before Carrington arrived. Word had quietly spread, he was back. Patrons spoke in low tones, many curious to witness the silent duel they had begun to hear rumors about. Staff moved with careful precision, each aware that tonight's dinner was no ordinary service. It was a stage, and everyone in the room, whether they knew it or not, was part of the audience. Amara prepared herself as usual, her movements calm, methodical. She organized trays, checked menus, and smoothed napkins without a hint of apprehension. When she glanced toward the door and saw Carrington enter, there was no flicker of hesitation. Her composure, by now, had become almost magnetic, a silent statement that whatever came tonight, she would meet it with the same quiet authority that had already unsettled him in the past encounters. Carrington moved through the room with his characteristic precision, scanning each table, acknowledging regulars with a measured nod, but his gaze lingered longer than usual in the direction of the counter where Amara worked. He arrived at his usual corner table and sat, his posture exuding confidence. But beneath it, there was a subtle tension, a signal that he was anticipating tonight's challenge more acutely than ever. When she approached with the wine list, he didn't wait. His voice carried across the table, firm yet smooth, laced with a test that demanded more than simple compliance. "Amara," he said, "tonight is about judgment, perception, and the subtle control of influence. Can you manage not only me but the awareness of everyone watching?" Her response was calm, clear, and unwavering. "Yes, I can manage that." The night unfolded like a careful choreography of tension. Carrington's questions were layered, testing her knowledge, subtly critiquing her choices, and even implying doubt about her capabilities. Yet each time, she met his gaze with steady eyes, answered with precise reasoning, and carried herself in a manner that deflected intimidation while asserting competence. The patrons in the restaurant began to sense the invisible battle taking place in the corner. Conversations quieted, the clatter of cutlery diminished, and whispers occasionally drifted toward the table. Even those who had not been part of previous encounters felt the weight of something extraordinary unfolding. Carrington, used to commanding control effortlessly, found himself increasingly frustrated by her unshakable composure. Every subtle provocation he launched was met with measured clarity, leaving him grasping for leverage he could not find. His typical charm, the tools of subtle intimidation he wielded so well, seemed to falter under her quiet strength. At one point, he posed a question designed to expose a potential flaw in judgment in front of the diners. Amara responded with a thoughtful, clear explanation, addressing both the content of his query and the unspoken challenge. Her words carried weight and authority, earning discreet, impressed glances from those nearby. The room itself seemed to lean in, aware that something rare and significant was taking place. Dessert arrived, and with it, the moment Carrington attempted one last subtle escalation, a verbal nudge meant to reassert control and leave Amara unsettled. She met it effortlessly, her response calm, articulate, and imbued with quiet conviction. In that instant, the invisible balance of power shifted. For the first time, Carrington was publicly met with an unyielding presence that refused to bow, leaving him visibly unsettled. When the dinner concluded, Carrington rose, composed yet subtly affected. His usual authority remained, but the evening had left an indelible impression. Amara had not only endured but had silently demonstrated a mastery of composure and judgment that commanded respect without a word of confrontation. As he exited, there was a shift in the room's energy, a quiet acknowledgement among the staff and patrons that the dynamics of power in this space had irrevocably changed. Amara had achieved what few could. She had, without raising her voice or breaking decorum, silenced the man everyone feared. The impact of her calm authority would resonate far beyond this night, altering not only the perception of Carrington but also the confidence of everyone who had witnessed the subtle yet undeniable victory. The following week, Carrington did something unusual. He didn't just come to dine. He arrived early, before the restaurant opened, to observe. Amara was already preparing tables, checking silverware, arranging napkins, and mentally mapping out her steps for the evening. The early presence of such a powerful man in the otherwise empty restaurant was unnerving for anyone else, but Amara moved with calm precision, as if she were expecting him. He walked through the doors alone, his posture impeccable, his gaze scanning every corner of the room. He didn't just take in the space, he studied it. The tables, the arrangement of chairs, the lighting, even the placement of candles on each table. Everything was observed with meticulous care. It was as if he were trying to anticipate the moves she might make tonight, measuring the stage before the performance began. When Amara approached his table, she did so without a trace of hesitation. She greeted him politely, placed the menu before him, and stood waiting. Carrington leaned back slightly in his chair, swirling the wine glass he hadn't even poured yet, and studied her with an intensity that could feel almost invasive. "Amara," he said finally, "tonight I want to see not just service but perception. Can you anticipate my needs before I even know them myself?" Her response was measured, calm, and unwavering. "I can, sir," she said simply, meeting his gaze evenly. "I observe, I listen, and I act when necessary. That is how I ensure the best experience for everyone." Throughout the meal, he began his subtle provocations. Small comments, intended to unsettle, questions about the wine's vintage, remarks on the plating of a dish, veiled doubts about her ability to handle a high-profile client. Each one was a calculated move, a test of composure and intelligence. But Amara met each challenge effortlessly, responding with clarity, thoughtfulness, and quiet authority. The patrons present were drawn into the silent duel without realizing it. Conversations softened, heads turned discreetly toward the corner, and even the kitchen staff paused to catch glimpses of the exchange. Carrington, a man who thrived on controlling both space and perception, was finding his usual dominance slipping through his fingers. By the time dessert arrived, Carrington escalated further. He asked a pointed question in front of a nearby table, something designed to embarrass or provoke her publicly. Amara responded without hesitation, her words calm, precise, and imbued with a quiet confidence that left everyone around them leaning in, listening intently. Even those not normally attentive to subtle social exchanges could feel the shift in power. Carrington's frustration became almost tangible. He had faced challenges before, but none had met his subtle tests with such unwavering poise. Each answer she gave was measured, yet carried weight. She wasn't just surviving the challenge, she was reshaping it. The room, once filled with quiet fear of him, now observed a dynamic that was both unfamiliar and compelling. When the meal ended and he rose to leave, there was a subtle hesitation in his posture. His eyes lingered on her for a moment longer than usual, a flicker of recognition and something approaching respect mixed with frustration. Amara had not spoken in anger, nor had she challenged him overtly. Yet she had silenced the millionaire in a way that no one else ever had. As he walked toward the door, the staff exchanged glances, quietly acknowledging what had just occurred. Amara had demonstrated something rare, a mastery of composure, perception, and quiet authority that commanded respect in a room where everyone feared him. Carrington had been tested, observed, and in that silent, almost imperceptible way, he had been bested. That night, even after the restaurant closed, the impact of the evening lingered. Amara had shifted the balance of power not with loud confrontation, but with calm, calculated presence. Carrington didn't arrive immediately that week. When he did, it was clear he had spent days preparing. Entering alone, impeccably dressed, his presence had subtly shifted. He walked slower, scanning the room and Amara with a strategist's eye, searching for any sign of weakness. Amara noticed him instantly but remained composed, moving with her usual grace as she prepared the dining room. She sensed the night would be different. His gaze was sharp, calculated, the look of a man unused to resistance. When he finally sat, the restaurant seemed to contract around him. He played his opening moves with casual comments and veiled provocations, remarks about wine, critiques of service, probing questions about her experience. Each was a test. Amara met everyone with poise, precision, and quiet authority. She wasn't defending herself. She was mastering the exchange. Patrons began to notice. Whispers drifted through the room, glances passed between tables, and the staff moved with heightened awareness. Carrington escalated with hypotheticals meant to corner her, but she answered each with measured clarity. The tension grew, silent but undeniable, the balance of power beginning to tilt. By dessert, his frustration was visible in the subtle set of his jaw. She had met every test without a crack in her composure. When he left, his elegance was tinged with agitation. A flicker of acknowledgement passed between them. She had held her ground. Even after the doors closed, the energy lingered. The room had witnessed a quiet shift. Carrington, for all his influence, had been bested in a battle of presence and intellect. It was only the beginning. Carrington's interest deepened into obsession. By midweek, he was arriving earlier, staying longer, watching her every movement with predator's focus. Amara noticed but carried on with flawless composure, her quiet authority drawing admiration from staff and patrons alike. His tactics grew sharper, leading questions, subtle critiques, and public hypotheticals designed to expose flaws. Yet she navigated every one with serene intelligence, never defensive, always deliberate. Her mastery lay not in defiance, but in control. The room felt the tension. Conversations hushed, diners glanced toward the corner, and the staff sensed the invisible duel. Even those unaware of their history knew something unusual was happening. Dessert brought another test, this time demanding judgment under scrutiny. Amara's answer was calm, precise, and unshakable, cementing her silent victory. Carrington's carefully maintained mask betrayed the faintest cracks. He was facing someone immune to his influence, a challenge he could neither ignore nor dominate. When he rose, his poise remained, but the night had reshaped the unspoken rules. Amara's presence had proven that authority could be commanded without intimidation. The following week, Carrington's strategy became deliberate. He engineered scenarios to test her under varying pressures, seating changes, high-profile guests, and well-timed provocations. He wanted to provoke the smallest lapse in her control. Amara, perceptive as ever, recognized the escalation. Yet she remained unshaken, every movement a quiet assertion of competence. Patrons noticed her effect on the room. The air felt charged, the atmosphere subtly altered by the duel at its center. Carrington's frustrations mounted. His methods, so effective elsewhere, failed here. Each failed attempt only deepened his fixation. The provocations became more public, calculated to draw a reaction before an audience. Still, Amara's replies were flawless. By dessert, the shift in power was undeniable. The room sensed it. Even those without context could feel the weight of the exchange. Carrington's elegance, though intact, carried the trace of a man who had been challenged and held at bay. By midweek, anticipation surrounded his visits. Regulars whispered about the Millionaire and the Waitress, and the restaurant felt like a stage. Staff executed their duties with precision, knowing eyes would be on the corner table. Amara moved with her usual calm, aware of every gaze. Carrington's entrance was deliberate, his presence commanding, but her steady poise met it without flinch. Their interaction drew the room's focus, a magnetism born of unspoken rivalry. He tested her relentlessly. Layered critiques, questions meant to destabilize, observations designed to expose weakness. She countered with measured grace, deflecting every move with intellect and composure. The air grew taut. Patrons leaned in, staff paused mid-task. Carrington's micro-expressions betrayed irritation beneath the polished surface. Amara's calm became the room's anchor, her authority quietly eclipsing his. By the final course, he issued a public test requiring discernment and judgment. Her answer, clear and confident, shifted the energy completely. Power now flowed toward her. When he rose to leave, he carried himself with practiced elegance, but his departure felt like retreat. Amara had not defeated him outright. She had made victory impossible without him conceding ground. As the doors closed, staff exchanged glances, patrons whispered, and the quiet understanding spread. This was no ordinary service, but an unfolding rivalry of presence and intellect. Carrington left with a simmering resolve. This was no longer curiosity, it was a calculated obsession. He would escalate again, determined to find the breaking point of a woman whose mastery lay in never appearing to need force at all. The decisive night had arrived. The restaurant was packed, filled with a silence heavy with anticipation. Among regulars and curious newcomers drawn by rumors, everyone awaited the next chapter in the silent duel between Millionaire Carrington and Waitress Amara, whose composure had been unsettling him for weeks. Carrington entered alone, immaculate as always, but with a different air, a restrained determination, as if planning a final test. He took his usual seat and studied Amara intently, as though trying to anticipate her every move. She sensed the shift. This was no casual visit. There was strategy and weight in the atmosphere. Still, she moved with quiet firmness, every gesture calculated to project control. He began with seemingly harmless questions and light comments, each laced with hidden barbs. He tried to provoke a slip, to gauge her reaction. Amara responded with clarity and poise, every word measured, every action precise, reinforcing her silent authority. Slowly, the room fell into an almost reverent focus. Conversations died down, eyes turned toward that corner. The first spark came when Carrington made a subtle remark meant to embarrass her. Her firm yet courteous reply erased the provocation. The tension shifted hands. For the first time, he realized his influence could be neutralized, not with open confrontation, but with calm intelligence. The escalation continued. He tried sharper subtleties. She, unshaken, held her ground. When dessert arrived, a near-sacred silence filled the air. His gaze sought to intimidate. Hers, steady and calm, made it clear she had nothing to prove. Everyone understood. The waitress had won. Carrington rose, composed but changed. It wasn't a humiliating defeat, but a tacit acknowledgement. Amara had shown that presence and serenity could make intimidation and wealth irrelevant. The atmosphere softened, replaced by silent respect. In that moment, the story of power was rewritten. The millionaire, a symbol of fear, had encountered a new kind of authority, one that needed no threats to impose itself. And Amara, without raising her voice, had forever altered how everyone saw that man, and herself. In the following days, the restaurant took on a new energy. Customers returned to see the woman who had silenced the most feared man, and the staff walked with greater confidence, inspired by her demeanor. Carrington came back as well, now more restrained, his interactions measured, as if he knew he was no longer in full control. The story spread as a quiet legend. What people talked about most wasn't the victory itself, but how it happened, without aggression, without shouting, only through the force of presence and self-control. Amara had shown that true authority requires neither wealth nor fear, only intelligence, observation, and the courage to remain unshaken. When the lights dimmed that night and the doors closed, one certainty remained. The millionaire's shadow had been transformed into silent acknowledgement, and the example of that scene would live on, influencing all who witnessed or heard the story. A lasting reminder that presence and self-mastery can overcome even the most feared power.